Start off by removing the engine cover held in place with two 10mm bolts. Then loosen the two hose clamps for the intake tube, and you'll also need to remove the 4 vacuum lines in the back of the intake tube, as well as the bolt holding the coolant line for your AC in the front. Then the tube just pops off. Now spray some penetrating oil on the ignition coil bolts here, especially if they're as rusty as the ones that I have. And while the penetrating oil is soaking in, remove the ignition coil wires and tuck them out of the way so that way we can have better access to the valve cover. And continue to remove any miscellaneous vacuum lines like this one here, and I just temporarily zip tied them off to the side to keep them out of the way. Use a vacuum or compressed air like I am here to remove as much debris as you can before removing the valve covers. Now remove the 4 10mm bolts holding the coil packs in place. I already had the number 2 coil pack removed for a previous job. Now remove your 4 coil packs and inspect them to see if you have any oil leaking, and you may want to consider labeling them so you can put them back in their original positions. Now carefully remove the 9 10mm bolts holding in place the valve cover. Most of them came out pretty easily with my impact, however a few on the bottom required coming out by hand. And unfortunately I broke the last bolt closest to the transmission dipstick, and that required me to drill it out and install a thread insert for a proper repair. Now you can remove the valve cover, and this was pretty much impossible to do with one hand, so I had to put the camera down and take it out with 2 hands. And you can see where the bolt head sheared off that last bolt, and unfortunately I still couldn't extract it and I had to drill it out. And do yourself a favor and cover up everything with a rag to avoid as much debris as possible from getting in there. Now use a Scotch-Brite pad and clean the entire mating surface as best you can. You want this to be as clean and shiny as possible to ensure you have a proper seal. And here I'm also using a pick to help remove some of the old gasket sealer, and then a little bit of compressed air to remove the rest of the debris and keep it from falling inside. Now remove the 2 semicircular plugs in the rear and clean these up as best you can. It took quite a bit of pressure to get them out, so just be patient. Now bend back the 4 metal tabs holding in place the spark plug tube gaskets, and these are pretty old and hard, so it required quite a bit of effort to pry them out. I used a little bit of ATF to help lubricate the spark plug tube gaskets and install the new ones. Then using a ball peen hammer, you'll go ahead and hammer those 4 metal tabs back into place. And it's really a better idea if you clean up those mating surfaces as best you can. And I also use some brake parts cleaner to clean up the entire inside of the valve cover. Use a Scotch-Brite pad to clean the channel for the new gasket so that way you have a proper seal, and then just press the new gasket into place as you see me doing here. Now use gasket sealant on these 2 front corners as well as the entire mating surface of the semicircular plugs in the rear, and make sure you seal up the entire joining surface of those semicircular plugs. Once the sealant has been applied, go ahead and reinstall the valve cover back into place. If your kit comes with the 9 seal washers for the bolts holding the valve cover in place, go ahead and replace those. Install them, and you're going to tighten them down to 53 inch-pounds. Reinstall the 4 ignition coils and tighten those bolts down to 53 inch-pounds as well. Reinstall the ignition coil wires as well as the tubing that was previously removed. Follow the same steps on the driver's side. However, some of the tubing is a little bit more difficult to work with, and I actually had to cut the fuel line and replace it with a new part later on. Unfortunately, I sheared the bolt off holding the number 7 ignition coil into place, so I had to leave the coil in place while removing the valve cover. This didn't work at all, so I had to drill the bolt out and install a thread insert. Just like the passenger side, remove the 2 semicircular plugs in the rear. And again, clean them up as best you can using a Scotch-Brite pad. Really take the time to clean these surfaces, otherwise you'll be dealing with more leaks in the future after you've replaced your valve cover gasket. Inevitably, some debris will fall into the head, so you'll probably want to change your oil and your filter after you've had the engine running for 10 or 20 minutes. And just like the passenger side, go ahead and apply some gasket sealant to these 2 corners as well as all mating surfaces of the 2 semicircular plugs located in the rear. I also spent about an hour cleaning the oxidation off of the 2 valve covers using a wire brush. Probably not necessary, but I did want to clean up my engine bay a little bit. And now, just like you did on the passenger side, go ahead and install the 4 new spark plug tube gaskets as well as the valve cover gasket, and then install it just like you did on the passenger side. Install the 9 seal washers on the 9 bolts for the valve cover, and then, just like the other side, torque these down to 53 inch-pounds. Install these 4 ignition coils and the 4 bolts holding them in place and torque them down to 53 inch-pounds. Reconnect the 4 ignition coil wires as well as some of the tubing that we removed earlier. And as I had previously mentioned, I had to replace the high pressure fuel line because I actually had to cut it off because it was so old and hard. And here you can see all the lines on the driver's side once everything's reconnected. So we have the brake booster vacuum line. And my vehicle does not have a high pressure fuel line quick disconnect. So that black shiny hose that you see right there is the new line that I had to install. I forgot to mention this earlier, but you might need to disconnect the oil dipstick, and that's just held in place with 1 bolt that you can access from inside the wheel well, and that will give you better access to removing the valve cover on the driver's side. And here's the passenger side once all the lines are connected. The 4 lines connected to the air intake are all different sizes, so you really don't need to label them when removing them. And thanks for watching. I hope this helped, and stay tuned for more maintenance videos on this 2002 Toyota Sequoia.